While we are a young species, we have a very big impact, right? We've been quite successful, almost 7 billion of us, on every continent on the planet. Probably the, quote, most short-term successful species on the planet for the few minutes that we've been here, right? We've done quite well, but I think if we do want to stick around, we need to find a different way and ask ourselves, do we want to fit upon the planet or do we want to fit within? When Darwin said survival of the fittest, he did not mean he who runs the fastest or lifts the most weights, right? He was talking about those species that are most well adapted, those species that most fit in, right? What does it mean to fit in? We've got a lot of things we got to toss around, although this is the world as we're talking about it, sustainability, environmentalism, climate issue, and toxics, and it's like you want to lock yourself inside and not go outside anymore. It's really, really scary. But it doesn't have to be scary, because we do have so much of a heritage. Thank God we're inheriting this. Thank God we're inheriting the answers if we just learn to ask. Because there's many, many cries of help, right? Many cries of help. So how do we find a way to go look? Because who really is at risk, right? Who is at risk? It's not us as much as it is our next generation, and the next generation, and the next generation. Planning for the 7 generations makes sense, because that's really, it's the continuity of the human race that's at risk, right? It's the continuity. We are nature. It's very easy as we sit here in this concrete space that's air conditioned and all of the parameters are meeting our needs to forget that we are nature. But if you look at us, there's nothing right-angled, right, and square about us. We are just as round as every other creature out there. We actually are subject to the same laws and rules, and, you know, natural selection will catch up with us, all right? We are nature. Refinding that connection and realizing that these boundaries are quite artificial is probably the first step. The challenge is that what we make, even though we're nature, is maladapted. All right? So this podium is actually natural. Right? This stadium is natural, the screen is natural, this technology is natural, but it's a maladapted form of a natural artifact. And the key for us is to find a way to be well adapted. All right? To transition all of our designs, not just our products, but our processes, our systems, our whole method and way of being, to being in that well-adapted, fitting in space. So imagine what our world would look like for just a moment if we begin to always ask the question, how would nature solve this? How would nature do this here? Not just how would humans do it, because we are nature, but how would the other creatures do it? And how might that look different? How has life not just survived on this planet, but truly, truly thrived, right? On this place we call home. This is our home too. How has life learned to do that? What would it look like if we learned from the Australian toad on how to make biodegradable, non-toxic adhesives? Or we looked at hippos and their sweat, actually. Their sweat is purple, and it's made out of something called hipposudoric acid. It has UV and antibacterial properties, non-toxic, right? Doesn't pollute the waterways where the hippos swim. Or we looked at the horned lizard, who does wick that water as a way to find our own ways of gathering water. What would it look like if we looked at the box fruit? The box fruit can float at sea for 2 years without biodegrading, right? So it's got this coating on it that makes it last exactly 2 years. Our biodegradable options are either 2 weeks or 10,000 years, right? We haven't really mastered that place in the middle, you know? So you wrap up your kids' cookies for the bake sale at school with some sort of plastic wrap, saran wrap, right? You only need it to last for the few hours to get to the school. And yet that piece of plastic will exist for 10,000 years. So what would it look like if we learned from the box fruit? What would it look like if we learned how to do optimal packaging? And how we packed and fit things very, very efficiently in small spaces by looking at sunflower heads. This is a redwood forest on the left, pumping water up 120 meters against gravity, right? 120 meters, thousands and thousands of gallons a day using just sunlight alone. No oil, no natural gas, no fuels are managing those pumps. What would our world sound like if that's how we moved our water? What would our buildings look like if we mimicked the way the chameleon changes color? It does its own temperature regulation by changing the color of its skin. Why not be white in summer and dark in winter? Right? Why not absorb the sun rays when we want and reflect when we don't want? What if we learned about growth and how to accommodate and expand for growth deployable structures if we look at the way a fern frond unfurls? Or what would our attachment mechanisms and our structures for being in water? I mean, if you look at the way kelp attaches to the seafloor, it's incredibly durable, but yet it's not a piling drilled deep into the seafloor, right? It can withstand a hurricane and still stay attached. What would our world look like? And why couldn't it begin to look like that? Well, one of the first things we have to do, this is the same dragonfly, same photo shoot, right? This is my daughter, is to quiet our cleverness, is to go back into that childlike mind and reward each other for asking the question, how? And no longer reward people for already knowing the answers, right? To quiet that cleverness, be willing to admit, while we have incredible brains and we have done a lot on this planet, we may not actually have all of the answers. We may not have the answers. And therefore we can do and practice what we call the conscious emulation of nature's genius. And those 4 words are actually pretty carefully chosen. So conscious implies intent, all right? To actually make the choice to ask the question, how would nature do this? Emulate is also an important word. We're not talking about photocopying nature, right? We're not talking about doing exactly what a dragonfly does in the way that we design our flying machines, our airplanes or helicopters. The laws of physics won't allow that, right? A dragonfly feels like he's swimming through syrup. So it's much easier for him to use his wings to do so than we would be able to. But could we emulate some of those deep design principles, pull out the essence of those? You may notice that on a lot of airplanes now they have the flipped up wingtips, right? So engineers are like, oh, this would be really clever. What happens if we flip up the wingtip and it changes the lift and the aerodynamics and you actually get better fuel efficiency? Well, next time you're out and you happen to see a large bird soaring in the sky, an eagle or a vulture, check out their wingtips. They've actually been doing it for, about 50 million years, flipping up those wingtips, right? So what if we emulate that deep pattern? We're not talking about putting feathers on wings, but let's take that last 10% and flip it up at an angle of 28 degrees or whatever it might be, so that we can see if that really does have the effect that we want. Genius is also, well, she has been around a little longer than we have. Right? Maybe there is something in those 10 months of wisdom, the 30 million possibilities out there. Actually, 30 million is the low estimate. 100 million is the high estimate on this planet. But yet that 30 to 100 million represents less than 1% of all the species that have ever lived on the planet. These are the success stories. We like to think that the R&D has already been done, right? How to live here is there. So perhaps there is some genius in there.